Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I do approve of that video. That was very good, educational. Just as a way to start out here, I'd like to thank you all for having me. I'd like to thank the Reverend for putting this together. And to all of our friends in Mansfield, England, I'm sure that you know how deep the connection is between our two municipalities. And you've certainly put a lot of hard work into this event. I enjoyed the tour of the chapel earlier. Certainly enjoyed that video, and I certainly I'm glad to make a contribution if I can. I was thinking this morning, do the other, there are so many Mansfields in the world. There's Mansfield, England, there's Mansfield, Massachusetts, there's Connecticut, there's Ohio, there's Texas here in the United States, Mansfield, Australia. They've gotten together, they've communicated. Many of you have maybe participated in cities, which has been active for on and off for 20 years now. And I wonder if do the Cambridges of the world do this? Do the Manchesters of the world do this? I don't know, but I like how strong our bond is, particularly between our two towns. So as the Reverend told you a little bit about myself, I am the Secretary of the Historical Society here in Mansfield. We're a small group, but we're dedicated to preserving the history of Mansfield such as it is. I've lived my entire life here in Mansfield, Mass. 3 out of my 4 grandparents were either born here or moved here when they were very, very young. I teach in nearby Taunton, Massachusetts. Just so you know, Taunton is part of this story too. Taunton is about 12 miles south of here. And that name is going to be important as I unfold the history of Mansfield, so you can just keep that in mind. I teach history and psychology. Just a quick note, Kevin McNatt, who's our president of our Historical Society for 20 years and a longtime good friend of mine, he does regret he was planning on being here today. And just the other day, he started a sentence to me and he said, "You're never going to believe this." And I knew some bad news was following. He had completely forgotten that he had a trip down the Cape this weekend, and he talked about, should I cancel? And I said, no, that's okay. I'll be better off. I told him I'd be better off without him, which of course wasn't true, but I told him that anyway. But he really wanted to do this because he has been very active in the Sister Cities Association. In 2000, he went to Mansfield, UK, and he had a great time. In 2004, he and I, among the many events when the Mansfields of the world were here, we hosted a walk up our Main Street, and he actually, then back in for the 2000 visit, the Earl of Mansfield, who I believe has died maybe 5 or 10 years ago, he was made an honorary member of our society, and I know that the Earl and Kevin were both pretty touched that we did that for him. So he really was disappointed and does regret that he couldn't be here today. It really is, though, an honor to be part of this tradition. There is a special kinship, I think, and we're bound together by your leadership, by the leadership that Sister Cities Association or your chapel or that has been, I think most of the leadership has come from England, which is great. And some of the connections that have been made over the years are fantastic. Just a few months ago, one of our members of our Historical Society showed me she said, "Oh, look, I just found this article." And in the article, in the 1920s, the mayor of Mansfield, England, sent Mansfield, Massachusetts, a gooseberry pie that was big enough to feed hundreds of people. And this was a big novelty in Mansfield, Mass. And people came, they cut it up into hundreds of different pieces, and there still wasn't enough because so many people wanted it. Luckily, they had some other pastries for those who didn't get a piece. Then in the 1930s, we have a man who scans our photographs and stores them on the computer. He just found some pictures of a friendship tree, which was planted behind our Fisher Richardson house, which is a small historical museum here in Mansfield. That man from England was a Mr. Humble, which is a good name. I don't know if anybody happens to know anyone who descends from him, but we just found that picture, and a friendship tree was planted at the Fisher Richardson house. So, and then of course, more recently, the connection between the two places with the Sister Cities Association. All right, just as a way to kick off, I just want to point out that Kevin and I really aren't, we are not 17th and 18th history of Mansfield specialists, mostly because we've been trying to focus our efforts on the 19th and 20th century because that history really hasn't been recorded yet. But luckily, we had a great historian locally named Jenny Copeland, who actually left her house to us. It's now our headquarters for our historical society. And anytime we have to consult, Jenny was born in 1879 and died in 1956. And luckily, she's always still around to help us as much as possible. Okay, I am going to attempt to share my screen, share on my screen this presentation that I made, and I am hopeful that you can see. Can anyone verify that you can see that?
Yes, we can.
Yes, you can. Okay, good. Let me just get it to come up full screen so you can see it just.
Just a minute, Andrew. Can you put up the volume a little higher? I had a message that they can't hear your voice properly.
I don't. This is actually, believe it or not, this is not my computer, so I don't think I can do that. But I will attempt to speak a little bit louder. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm hopeful that you're able to hear me. Can you hear me now? You can hear me? Okay. I will speak as loud as I can, certainly. Okay. So let me put up this map here while I begin to give you a little bit of the background. The Pilgrims, of course, as you just learned, arrived in 1620 in Plymouth, and it didn't take too long before they began to look westward. So Plymouth, of course, is right on what's now coastal Massachusetts, as part of the Plymouth colony. And then about 17 years later, the town of Taunton was settled, which you can see here. Now on this map, what is now Mansfield, Easton, Norton, Rainham, I know in England you would say Rainham, here we say Rainham, Taunton, Dighton, and Berkeley were all a part of Taunton. So what's now Taunton and 6 other towns was quite a big town, as you can see. In time, they all kind of peeled away one by one. So in 1637, Taunton was settled. It was incorporated as a town in 1639, I'm sorry, as a town in 1639. So that's just 19 years after Plymouth. It's a very old town for here in America. So it's about 20, and just so you give you an orientation, it's about 25 miles to the west of Plymouth. So it's inland a little bit. And we are 12 miles about from the center of Taunton to the center of Mansfield. It was first known, there was a native settlement there. It was known as Cohannet by the natives. The English soon changed the name to Taunton because many of the settlers who came out were from Taunton, England. I'm not sure how close that is to Mansfield, England, but Taunton, England, and Somerset, England. There's also a Somerset, Mass, not too far away. So they kind of named those towns as they to kind of mirror what they had in England. But nobody, well, first of all, until about 1640, no European had really laid foot in Mansfield. At that time, Miles Standish, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was sort of the military aide, I guess you'd say, to the Plymouth colony. He and a bunch of men came up and surveyed what they called the Cohannet Purchase. Part of that came all the way up to a sliver of Mansfield. And there was a place in Mansfield now known popularly as Cobbler's Corner because Standish's party, a member of his party had a problem with his shoe. They had to stop and cobble his shoe. So hence it's still called Cobbler's Corner. So that was the first that European settlers had made their way to Mansfield, Mass. But most of the rest of what would become Mansfield was added to Taunton in 1668. It was called the North Purchase. And it consisted of, if you look at that map, what is now Norton, Easton, and Mansfield. Those 3 towns were sort of the North Purchase. So they became sort of the northern end of the town of Taunton. Now Mansfield itself, or what's now Mansfield, was rather isolated. In the pre-European era, there really weren't a lot of major, in fact, there were no major native settlements here that any historian has ever been able to turn up. It was sort of a no man's land. To the south were the Wampanoags, who you just heard about, and to the north were the Massachusetts Indians, or the Massachusetts natives. And between the two of them, in between, this was sort of like a buffer zone. So there would have been meadows, rivers, streams, and there were summer camps that were set up here by the natives. But for the most part, no permanent settlements. They would have come here to hunt, to fish, but other than that, you didn't see a lot of permanent settlements. They may have set up camp for a week or 2 or a month or 2. So Mansfield was kind of isolated. And if the early settlers of Taunton wanted to find their way up to what's now Mansfield, they probably would have had to have followed the rivers, or maybe the few paths that the natives had worn over the years. All right, so European settlers really arrived in Mansfield, what will become Mansfield, in the 1680s. So you're talking, what's that, some 60 years after the settlement of Plymouth. It was still so rugged and rough that that was a fairly good distance west at that time, even though, of course, America, we would settle the rest of America pretty quickly after that. So anyway, as I told you, Mansfield, Norton, Easton, Rainham, Berkeley, and Dighton all eventually peeled away and became their own towns. And it was 1711 that Norton peeled away from Taunton. So that was Norton, Easton, and Mansfield. If you see the three of them on the map, they peeled away and they became the town of Norton. Some say that the name, we believe that the name came from the idea that it was the north town of Taunton, which sort of got rolled together into Norton. That was in 1711. All right. So the most important thing you could have to become a town was the ability to support a church and a minister. And that's what Norton was able to do. And that's why they were able to break from Taunton. In 1725, the eastern portion became Easttown or Easton, right? And they broke away in 1725. Now, the people who were living in Mansfield at that time, only probably about 400, or what would become Mansfield, I should say, were looking to get, they said, if Easton can break away, why can't we? We don't want to make the trek, the 6-mile trek down to Norton, which was very long at that time, because you were, you know, if you had lucky enough to have a horse maybe, or you might have to walk it. The roads were very rough. The winters were freezing cold. The summers were dreadfully hot. And to walk or go by horseback down to Easton every Sunday was kind of a trek. But Norton, after just having lost Easton, was not in the mood to lose Mansfield as well. So town meeting said no. But finally, by 1731, we were allowed, 20 years after Norton broke from Taunton, we were allowed to become what was called a precinct. The people in Norton protested. They said that was an illegal vote. They spelled it E-L-L-E-A-G-E-A-L, kind of a funny spelling, but that's the way the old records state. But they appealed to Boston, and that appeal went nowhere. So now we had the ability, even though we were in a town, we were allowed to have our own meeting house and our first minister. A very crude meeting house was built in just after 1731. It didn't even have windows. It had oiled paper to take the place of the windows. And our very first minister was Ebenezer White. He didn't arrive till 1736. It took 5 years. We were such an outpost. It took 5 years for anyone to agree and actually come here and minister to the people of Mansfield. In 1770, Mansfield was raised to the level of what they called a district. A district meant you were a town in virtually all shapes and manner and sizes, except that you didn't get representation in the general court in what we would now call the state legislature. In 1775, by act of the state legislature, we were elevated to a town, as you can see by virtue of this sign, even though we weren't even about 1,000 people. But this meant that now we had our own church, as we had for quite some time, as we also were able to get representation in the state legislature. So now the question becomes, oh, by the way, about this sign, let me just take a quick moment aside here. These signs are pretty iconic in Massachusetts. On the main roads between when you pass from one town to another, the state chose this design maybe 100 years ago, I don't know. So these are kind of symbols of Massachusetts. You see these all over the state of Massachusetts. So where did Mansfield get its name? That's the next thing that I was asked to tell you about. And this is kind of an interesting story. Now I'm going to ask you to recall that we were, as I said earlier, the Norton North Precinct, right? First we were part of Taunton, then we were a part of Norton. And we became a district in 1770. And when we were allowed to become a district, this is when the term or the name Mansfield first comes into use. The Norton North Precinct did not have a name, but the townspeople still sent a petition to the legislature, to the general court, as it was called at the time, and they approved it without a name. And apparently when it got to the desk of the royal governor, whose name was Thomas Hutchinson, if you remember his name from history at all, when it got to Hutchinson's desk, he chose the name. And he was a great admirer of William Murray, who you see here, who was the very first Earl of Mansfield, who you probably know more about than me, I would venture to guess, perhaps. And he was such an admirer of Lord Mansfield that he named this new town Mansfield. So that's where we got our name, directly from the first Earl of Mansfield. Actually, Kevin secured a portrait of the Earl, this, I think it's this very portrait actually, and it's hanging in our town hall, actually hanging over our board of selectmen, or select board as they call it now, to sort of remind them of some of our heritage and where it comes from. So we have not yet forgotten the Earl here on this side of the pond. He also, you might remember some of the more significant things about the Earl, about Lord Mansfield. He was Chief Justice of the King's Bench, and he was made a lot of reforms to British law, and also laid down the case of Somerset versus Stuart, which eventually ended the slave trade in the British Empire. So he really was historically important. All right, so that's how the town got its name. The next question is, what about its religious beginnings? So first, I would just remind you that I'm not a theologian, but I am a historian. So let me just do my best to explain these as these issues such as we understand them. So Mansfield's early religious traditions. Most of this area was settled by descendants of the Pilgrims. Okay, we definitely know that for sure. Most of the early families were descendants of the Pilgrims, or if not, they were families that came very, very soon thereafter. A few from Puritans, also from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, I should explain that Plymouth Colony was its own colony, and Massachusetts Bay to the north. Eventually, in 1691, they were absorbed into one. They became the state of Massachusetts like we know it today. But originally, they were two different colonies up until the year 1691. So at that time, towns were really held together socially, politically, and really in every other way by the church itself. So the first meeting house that I told you about before, built in the 1730s in Mansfield, was torn down. And this meeting house, which stood on our South Common right in the center of town, was built in 1766 and torn down in 1888. So it stood for quite some time. So the town now had this ability to support its own church, to hire its own minister as of 1731. This was built, as I said, in 1766. So the parish was really the center of town government. You paid your taxes to the church. You paid to the parish, okay? To the parish, which was, again, descended from the faith of the Pilgrims. You went to school there if there was any sort of early formal schooling. Meetings there. You went to, many a social function there. It really was sort of of course, there were taverns and there were stores and stuff like that where people would also gather, but it really was the heart of the community. And it's important to sort of understand this. And you might think that when we think of America, sometimes we think of the Declaration of Independence and the separation of church and state and all that. But this system continued, even though that was 1776, this system continued until 1833. Right? Up until the early 1800s, the parish, as it was known, okay, was essentially what we would now call congregational. Right? At least this country we would say it's congregational, sort of the spiritual descendants of the Pilgrims. It worked. It worked throughout the 1700s. It worked up until about 1830. This is where things began to take a bit of a turn. Right? So this model did in fact work well for a long time, but by the 1830s, problems were starting to arise. In the 1830s, the town parish, and by the way, there were, I should take a quick aside, there were other denominations here at that time. There were Quakers, there were Methodists, there were later Baptists. Eventually, in the 1730s, the first Catholics began to move to town. So there was some diversity, but it didn't matter what you were, you still paid your taxes to the parish. So in the 1830s, the parish hired a minister by the name of James Seward. All right, Seward had liberal tendencies, and these included, he kind of gravitated towards Unitarianism, all right? And many in the parish began to see this as unacceptable. They followed the more Orthodox tradition of the Trinity. Not that I don't think he was a true Unitarian, but it sounds like he had Unitarian leanings, Unitarian tendencies. And this really increased the tension in the town. That's how important an issue it was at that time. Then in 1836, so just a year or two after Reverend Seward arrived, a really amazing event happened in this town that transformed it forever. Here in America, of course, slavery had been abolished in the North, but it still existed in the South. And there was a number of abolitionists, as they're called, people who wanted to eliminate slavery here in Mansfield. There were probably just as many that either A, didn't care, or B, wanted to maintain it because somehow their economic life was tied into the slavery of the South, whether they benefited from the cotton industry or the shoe industry or whatever industry they might have benefited from. So for whatever reason, you had many in the parish were anti-slavery, many others were not. Excuse me, yes, in the parish they were anti-slavery, many others in town were not. So a group from the parish decided to hire a speaker in 1836 by the name of Charles Burleigh. Charles Burleigh was a fervent anti-slavery abolitionist. He wore a big long beard and he swore that he would never shave it until slavery was abolished. So Mr. Burleigh shows up to town one day to deliver an anti-slavery speech to the parish, okay? However, the anti-slavery forces arrive at the meeting house and they show up with bugles, they show up with drums, they start yelling and screaming, and the doors are shut and they're trying to drown out his speech. Burleigh only speaks louder and louder. They end up breaking through the door and they run in and cause chaos, okay? As a result, the constable, a man by the name of Chandler Cobb, comes in and quite literally read them the Riot Act. He said, listen, you can't do this. You just cease and desist at once and get out. The mob was so angry, that the pro-slavery mob was so angry, someone punched him in the nose and bloodied his nose. Anyway, they eventually break up this riot. And as a result, now the tensions are really, really high in this town at the time. So our liberal minister, I guess, Reverend Seward, with his Unitarian tendencies, you might remember him, he remained mostly silent, as it turned out. He didn't really want to violate anybody. He didn't really want to take a side one way or the other. And as it turns out, the Reverend, people grew tired of the Reverend. And this is where the split eventually comes. The Orthodox, he resigned in 1837, but what would become, I may show you this slide right here, the Orthodox Congregational Church, built right across the street from the old meeting house that you saw earlier, breaks away and they become a new congregation. They're still here today. In fact, I think they may be addressing you either before or after me. I'm not sure if you've heard from them yet or not. They break away. And as it turns out, the old meeting house, go back to this for a second. The old meeting house becomes a Unitarian church. It's moved off the common in 1871 to a lot right next door. In 1888, it was kind of decided it was a little too ramshackle and they tore it down. It outlived its usefulness. So unfortunately, that building doesn't stand anymore. A new Unitarian church was formed and the Unitarian congregation persisted in Mansfield till about the 1830s when it disappeared for good. The Congregational church does in fact remain. For years, up until about 20 years ago, it was known as the Orthodox Congregational Church, again, because of that orthodoxy of very strong towards Trinitarianism, not towards Unitarianism. That was their bent, I guess you'd say. And then it remains a it looks a little bit different today. It's all white. They don't have that dark colored trim anymore, but it does look essentially the same today, and it sits exactly in the position where it was built. So that was the basic story. Mansfield, Taunton was settled. Norton, Mansfield, and Easton broke away as a unit. They peeled away in time. Eventually, Mansfield got to a point where it could support its own minister. Things were good for a long, long time. By the 1830s, the divide between Unitarianism and Trinitarianism broke the parish apart, the original parish apart, and sort of the Congregationalists today, who are still around, they can probably lay claim in this town anyway as the most direct descendants of the Pilgrims. You would see, even though of course many others are, but they would be the most direct descendants, spiritual descendants anyway, of the Pilgrims, because they broke from that original parish. I should mention, of course, there were other religious traditions, like I said earlier. There were early Methodists, early Quakers, early Baptists. We had an Episcopalian church. We have a large Catholic church now. It's sort of the predominant of the various denominations now. In recent years, we've had a rabbi move to town. We don't actually have a synagogue, but now he has a Jewish center. He runs it right out of his house, but he hosts Hanukkah ceremonies, I guess you'd say, and services, Rosh Hashanah and the various holidays. And we even have the old St. Mary's Church, which was the Catholic Church. That is now, there's a new St. Mary's Church, well, it's 50 years old now, and the old one is now an Islamic high school. So, and so one of the bigger ones around. So we really do have quite a religious, I'd say, melting pot, or however you'd like to term it, here in Mansfield. So anyway, that's a pretty quick rundown. I tried to give it to you relatively quickly, but that's basically how descendants of the Pilgrims eventually moved about 25 miles to the west, then came a little north, and really helped to play a key role in the settlement of this town and the history of this town as well. So with that, I guess I'd like to turn it back to the Reverend, and I believe that you'd like to, let me put up my last slide. Wait a minute. See, now you can see them all at once. Isn't that exciting? But that's sort of, I know that's kind of quick. I threw a lot of facts at you, but certainly if you'd like to me to clarify anything, or if you'd like me to add anything, I'd be happy to do that at this time.